Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that while the world's attention has been focused on wars, economic uncertainty, and political upheaval, a silent catastrophe has been unfolding across the developed world that threatens to collapse entire civilizations within our lifetime? And what if I told you that this crisis, more devastating than any military conflict, more destructive than any economic recession, has been quietly solved by one country and only one country in a way that positions it to inherit the economic and political leadership of the entire Western world? This crisis is not a pandemic, it's not climate change, and it's not nuclear war. It's something far more fundamental and inescapable, the complete collapse of birth rates across every developed nation on Earth. And while countries like Japan, Germany, Italy, and South Korea face demographic extinction within decades, Canada has engineered a solution so elegant, so systematic, and so strategically brilliant that it has transformed what should have been our greatest weakness into our ultimate competitive advantage. For the past 50 years, every developed country has been walking into the same demographic trap, and most of them don't even realize they're already caught. The mathematics are simple and terrifying. When birth rates fall below 2.1 children per woman, the replacement rate needed to maintain population stability, countries enter a demographic death spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Today, we're going to examine how this crisis is destroying our competitors, why Canada's solution represents one of the most sophisticated long-term strategies in modern history, and how our approach to demographic management has positioned us to dominate the 21st century while other nations collapse under the weight of aging populations and economic stagnation. Before we dive deeper into this analysis, if you're finding this perspective on Canada's demographic strategy valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to produce detailed analysis of the strategic developments that will determine which nations thrive and which nations fade into irrelevance. To understand why demographics represent an existential crisis for developed nations, we need to examine the fundamental mathematics of modern societies. Every economic system, every social program, every government budget is built on the assumption of continuous population growth and a steady supply of young workers to support aging populations. When birth rates fall below replacement level, countries face what demographers call the demographic transition trap. Fewer children mean fewer future workers, which means less tax revenue, which means governments cannot afford the health care, pensions, and social services that aging populations require. This creates a vicious cycle. Economic stress leads to even lower birth rates as families delay or avoid having children due to financial uncertainty. The numbers are staggering and undeniable. Japan's birth rate has fallen to 1.3 children per woman, meaning each generation is 38% smaller than the previous one. Germany sits at 1.54, Italy at 1.25, and South Korea has achieved the lowest birth rate in human history at just 0.81 children per woman. At current rates, South Korea's population will shrink by 60% within 50 years, and the country will effectively cease to exist as a functioning society. But the crisis extends far beyond East Asia and Europe. The United States, despite its image as a dynamic, growing economy, has seen its birth rate fall to 1.66 children per woman, well below replacement level. Without immigration, the American population would already be shrinking, and even with current immigration levels, the U.S. faces severe labor shortages, unsustainable pension obligations, and economic stagnation within the next 2 decades. The economic implications of demographic collapse are catastrophic and unavoidable. Japan provides the clearest preview of what awaits other developed nations. Since the 1990s, Japan has experienced 3 decades of economic stagnation, deflation, and declining living standards directly attributable to demographic decline. The Japanese government spends increasingly large portions of its budget on elder care while tax revenue shrinks due to a diminishing workforce. Japanese companies cannot find workers. Japanese universities are closing due to lack of students, and entire regions of the country are being abandoned as young people concentrate in a few remaining urban centers. The Japanese military cannot recruit enough personnel. Japanese technological innovation has stagnated, and Japanese global influence has evaporated as the country turns inward to manage demographic collapse. Germany faces a similar trajectory despite its current economic strength. German manufacturers are already experiencing severe labor shortages. German universities are recruiting internationally to fill programs, and German social security systems are projected to become insolvent within 15 years without massive reforms or unprecedented immigration increases. The German government has acknowledged that the country needs approximately 400,000 immigrants annually just to maintain current economic activity levels. But German society has proven unable to integrate immigration at the scale required to offset demographic decline. Anti-immigration political movements have gained strength precisely because demographic pressures are forcing rapid social change that many Germans find uncomfortable. Italy represents perhaps the most advanced case of demographic collapse among major European nations. With a birth rate of 1.25 children per woman and limited immigration, Italy's population is projected to fall from 59 million today to 36 million by 2070. Italian schools are closing, Italian military recruitment is failing, and entire Italian regions are offering free housing to attract residents from other parts of Europe. The Italian economy has stagnated for 2 decades. Italian government debt has become unsustainable, and Italian political systems have become increasingly unstable as economic pressure from demographic decline creates social tensions and political extremism. Italy provides a preview of what awaits other European nations that cannot solve their demographic crises. But the most dramatic example of demographic catastrophe is unfolding in South Korea, where the birth rate has fallen so low that the country faces complete population collapse within living memory. At current rates, South Korea will have more people over 65 than under 30 within 15 years. The South Korean military will not have enough recruits to maintain current force levels. South Korean companies will not have enough workers to maintain current production. And South Korean universities will not have enough students to maintain current programs. South Korean society has entered a state of demographic panic, with government programs offering cash payments for children, subsidized housing for young families, and free childcare for all citizens. None of these programs have succeeded in raising birth rates because the fundamental economic and social conditions that cause low fertility rates remain unchanged. The crisis extends beyond individual countries to encompass entire regions and alliance systems. NATO faces a demographic crisis as member nations struggle to maintain military recruitment levels and defense spending while supporting aging populations. The European Union faces demographic divergence as some member states experience population decline while others maintain growth through immigration, creating political tensions and economic imbalances. Even China, despite its massive population, faces demographic collapse due to the long-term effects of the one-child policy and rapid economic development. Chinese birth rates have fallen below replacement level, Chinese workforce growth has stopped, and Chinese economic growth is slowing as demographic pressures reduce domestic consumption and increase social spending requirements. The global implications are staggering. Within 30 years, most developed nations will face simultaneous economic decline, social instability, and military weakness due to demographic collapse. The international system built around Western democratic leadership could collapse as these nations become unable to maintain their economic competitiveness, military capabilities, and political influence. This brings us to Canada's remarkable achievement in solving the demographic crisis that is destroying every other developed nation. While our competitors have struggled with declining birth rates and failed integration policies, Canada has engineered a demographic strategy so sophisticated and successful that it has transformed our aging population challenge into a massive competitive advantage. The Canadian solution is built on 3 interconnected pillars that work together to create sustainable population growth, economic dynamism, and social cohesion. These pillars represent decades of careful policy development, strategic planning, and institutional innovation that other countries have been unable to replicate, despite having access to the same basic approaches. The first pillar is the most visible. Canada operates the world's most successful immigration system, bringing in approximately 400,000 new residents annually through programs designed to maximize economic benefits while maintaining social stability. But this is not simply about numbers. It's about the systematic selection and integration of immigrants who contribute immediately to economic growth and long-term demographic stability. Canada's Express Entry system uses a points-based approach that prioritizes young, educated English or French-speaking immigrants with job skills that match labor market needs. This ensures that new Canadians contribute to tax revenue from arrival rather than requiring years of social support before becoming economically productive. The provincial nominee programs allow different regions to select immigrants based on specific local economic needs, ensuring that immigration supports economic development across the entire country rather than concentrating in a few urban centers. The Canadian Experience Class provides pathways for temporary workers and international students to become permanent residents, creating immigration flows that are already familiar with Canadian society and employment markets. But the real genius of the Canadian immigration system lies in its integration approach, which represents the second pillar of our demographic strategy. Unlike European countries that struggle with parallel societies and integration failures, Canada has developed social and economic structures that turn immigrants into productive Canadians within a single generation. Canadian credential recognition programs ensure that immigrant professionals can use their skills in the Canadian economy, rather than driving taxis or working in restaurants, despite having advanced degrees. Canadian language training programs provide free English and French instruction that enables immigrants to participate fully in economic and social life. The Canadian multicultural model, rather than demanding cultural assimilation, creates space for immigrant communities to maintain cultural identities while adopting Canadian values and participating in Canadian institutions. This reduces social tensions that have plagued immigration programs in other countries and enables Canada to attract immigrants from diverse backgrounds without creating internal conflicts. Canadian settlement services provide housing assistance, employment counseling, and social integration support that helps immigrant families establish stable lives quickly, rather than struggling with poverty and social isolation that can persist for generations in other countries. The third pillar of Canada's demographic strategy is the most sophisticated and least understood: the creation of economic and social conditions that encourage both immigrant and Canadian-born families to have children at rates that support long-term population stability. While other countries have tried direct financial incentives for childbearing, Canada has focused on creating social infrastructure that makes raising families economically viable and socially supported. Universal health care eliminates the enormous costs associated with pregnancy and childbirth that discourage family formation in countries like the United States. Subsidized child care programs reduce the economic burden of raising children while enabling parents, particularly women, to maintain careers and contribute to family income. Parental leave policies that provide up to 18 months of job-protected leave with income support allow families to care for children without sacrificing long-term economic security. Canadian housing policies that prioritize family-friendly communities over investor speculation help ensure that young families can afford homes large enough for children in neighborhoods, with good schools and community services. Canadian education funding that provides high-quality public education reduces the private costs of raising children while ensuring that the next generation has skills needed for economic competitiveness. The results of this integrated approach are remarkable and unique among developed nations. Canada's population grows by approximately 1.2% annually, the highest rate among G7 countries and one of the highest among all developed nations. Canadian total fertility rates, while below replacement level, remain higher than most developed countries and are supplemented by immigration that creates overall population growth. More importantly, Canadian demographic growth is economically productive rather than economically burdensome. New Canadians contribute to tax revenue, start businesses, fill labor shortages, and support economic growth that benefits all residents. Canadian families, both immigrant and Canadian-born, raise children who become educated, productive citizens who sustain economic growth and social programs. Canadian demographic strategy creates a virtuous cycle. Economic growth generates tax revenue that funds social programs that support families and attract immigrants who contribute to economic growth. This cycle enables Canada to maintain social programs, infrastructure investment, and economic competitiveness, while competitor nations face declining tax revenue and increasing social costs from aging populations. The strategic implications of Canada's demographic success become clear when we examine what this means for international competition over the next 30 years. While other developed nations face workforce shortages, economic stagnation, and social instability, Canada will have a growing productive population that supports economic expansion and international influence. Canadian companies will have access to skilled workers while competitors struggle with labor shortages. Canadian governments will have growing tax revenue to invest in infrastructure, education, and innovation, while competitors face budget cuts and declining public services. Canadian military will have recruitment pools while competitors cannot maintain force levels. Canadian universities will attract international students and faculty while competitors face declining enrollment and research capacity. Canadian cities will grow and modernize while competitors face urban decline and infrastructure decay. Canadian cultural and technological influence will expand while competitors become increasingly inward-focused and economically dependent. The demographic advantage extends to geopolitical influence and alliance leadership. As European NATO members struggle with declining military recruitment and defense spending pressures from aging populations, Canada's growing population and economic strength position it to play larger roles in alliance leadership and international security. As American demographic challenges create domestic political instability and economic uncertainty, Canada's demographic stability provides reliability and predictability that international partners value highly. Canadian demographic success attracts investment, talent, and partnership opportunities from countries seeking stable, growing markets and reliable long-term cooperation. The competitive advantage is already visible in economic data and international relationships. Canadian GDP growth consistently outperforms other G7 nations, partly due to demographic advantages that create domestic demand and workforce growth. Canadian housing markets remain dynamic due to population growth that creates ongoing demand for construction and urban development. Canadian tech sector growth is supported by immigration programs that attract skilled workers from around the world, giving Canadian companies access to talent pools that competitors cannot reach due to immigration restrictions or integration failures. Canadian resource development benefits from population growth that provides workers and domestic demand for infrastructure investment. But the most profound implications of Canada's demographic strategy extend beyond economics to encompass fundamental questions about which societies will survive and prosper in the 21st century. The countries that can maintain dynamic, growing populations while preserving social cohesion and economic competitiveness will inherit global leadership from countries that cannot solve their demographic crises. Canada's approach represents a new model for developed societies, one that embraces diversity and immigration as sources of strength rather than treating them as necessary evils or threats to cultural identity. The Canadian model demonstrates that it is possible to maintain Western democratic values, high living standards, and social stability while creating space for new citizens from around the world. This model is being studied and partially copied by other countries, but none have achieved Canada's level of success due to political, cultural, and institutional barriers that Canada has systematically overcome through decades of policy development and social evolution. The Australian immigration system borrows heavily from Canadian approaches, but faces geographic isolation and smaller scale that limit overall impact. The New Zealand immigration system uses similar points-based selection, but lacks the institutional capacity for large-scale integration. Various European experiments with Canadian-style immigration programs have failed due to political opposition and integration difficulties. The American immigration system, despite the country's historical success with immigration, has become dysfunctional due to political polarization and institutional paralysis that prevents systematic approaches to immigration and integration. Canada's demographic strategy represents more than just a solution to population decline. It represents a competitive strategy for dominating the 21st century, while other developed nations struggle with the consequences of demographic collapse. Friends, as we examine the scope and implications of Canada's demographic achievement, we must recognize that we are witnessing one of the most significant strategic developments of our time. While the world's attention focuses on military conflicts and economic disruptions, Canada has quietly solved the fundamental crisis that threatens the survival of developed societies. The demographic collapse facing Europe, East Asia, and even the United States is not a temporary challenge that can be addressed through short-term policies or minor adjustments. It is an existential crisis that will determine which nations prosper and which nations fade into irrelevance over the next 50 years. Canada's solution to this crisis represents sophisticated long-term strategic thinking that transforms demographic challenges into competitive advantages. Our immigration system, integration programs, and family support policies work together to create sustainable population growth, economic dynamism, and social cohesion that other countries have been unable to achieve. The implications extend far beyond domestic policy to encompass fundamental shifts in global power and influence. As our competitors struggle with aging populations, labor shortages, and economic stagnation, Canada will enjoy the advantages of a growing, productive population that supports expanding international influence and leadership opportunities. We are witnessing the early stages of a transformation that will reshape the international system as dramatically as the rise and fall of previous great powers. The difference is that this transformation is driven not by military conquest or technological revolution, but by demographic engineering and social innovation that ensures long-term societal survival and prosperity. Canada has solved the crisis that will destroy every other developed country, and this solution positions us to inherit leadership of the Western world as our competitors collapse under the weight of their demographic failures. The mathematical inevitability of this transformation is already visible in current demographic projections and economic trends. By 2050, Canada's population is projected to reach 50 million people, while Germany's population shrinks to 75 million, Japan's falls to 100 million, and South Korea's collapses to 35 million. These numbers represent fundamental shifts in economic capacity, military potential, and international influence that will reshape global power structures. Canadian cities will grow while competitor cities shrink. Canadian companies will expand while competitors downsize. Canadian tax revenue will increase while competitors face budget crises. Canadian military recruitment will thrive while competitors cannot maintain force levels. Canadian universities will attract global talent while competitors lose students and faculty to demographic decline. The strategic patience and systematic approach that Canada has brought to demographic management represents a masterclass in long-term national planning that other countries have been unable to match due to political short-termism and institutional failures. Thank you for joining me in examining this remarkable strategic achievement. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for continued coverage of the developments that will determine Canada's rising global influence. Have you observed demographic changes, immigration patterns, or family support programs in your community? Share your observations in the comments below. Your local perspective helps illustrate the scope of Canada's demographic transformation.